In this video, I want to talk about what is required in order to run a cake script in a fully offline mode. Now the question is, why would you want to do that? The reasons are lots, depending on your situation, but the typical one that we hear about is that within an organization, you are not meant to or you're not allowed to reach out to the outside world to bring down any sort of dependencies. All of those dependencies must be in-house hosted somewhere. So rather than using NuGet.org, you might have an internally hosted system likes of Nexus or ProGet that are hosting all your dependencies. So what we want to figure out is what changes we need to make to both the cake bootstrapper and the cake configuration in order to make it work that way. So first of all, let's talk about what happens when we do a typical build. So if we go into here, all I've got in this project so far is just an empty build.cake file. So if I go ahead and just use the snippet and add a sample project, a sample build script here that's doing nothing other than doing the setup, doing teardown, and printing out information. In order to get this to work, we're going to need a bootstrapper. So first of all, we can use some of the built-in commands to go and reach out for that bootstrapper. So that bootstrapper is coming from the outside world. So that's the first thing that is needs to be changed. Now, typically, bootstrapper, once you've downloaded it, installed it, that's something that's checked into your repository. So that's not something you have to reach out every single time to pull down. So that's not something we have to worry about necessarily, but it's just something to bear in mind. So if we go ahead and run this build now, if we watch on the left-hand side here, a couple of things are happening, obviously. We're going to reach out and we're going to pull down a packages.config file. That packages.config file specifies the version number of cake that we're using. So again, that's come from the outside world. Cake's also pulled down the NuGet.exe because that's needed to do the installation of the add-ins and the tools that we're making use of. On top of that, we've pulled down cake itself. So we've reached out to NuGet and we've pulled down that entire cake package and extracted it locally onto the system. So all of those things have been something that's reached out to the outside world and pulled it locally into your machine. So everything that's within the tools folder, with the exception of the packages.config file, are not things that we would recommend that you check into your repository. So we need to find a way to modify both the bootstrapper and cake itself to not reach out to that external systems. So what I'm going to do is if I go ahead and rename this file here, and we'll call this original, what I want to do is I want to use another system to house some of those artifacts for us. So what I've got over here, bring this over, is I'm using a system called Nexus. Nexus is an internally hosted NuGet repository. So what you can do within here is you can have multiple feeds in the same way that there's a NuGet.org, or you might use myget.org for hosting some of your packages. You can host all of them internally. So what I've done is I've created, or I'm making use of, the internal feed that comes out of the box, and I've added some packages to this repository. Now they're coming, it's essentially a mirror of the ones that are coming down from NuGet.org, but they now live locally on my machine. So for testing purposes, I pulled down a few packages here, and in the background, it's actually pulled down earlier versions of those packages because that's the way that it's currently set up. But what this means is if I switch back to here, then we can specify that we want some of those artifacts to come from that Nexus server rather than from the Cake website or from NuGet.org itself. So the way that looks, if we go into the settings of, for example, I'm within Visual Studio Code here, but what we can do is that there is some built-in configuration within Visual Studio Code for Cake itself. So here we're specifying that the bootstrappers, this is the download URL for the bootstrappers, and this is the download URL for configuration file. So what we can do is if I copy over from a notepad that I've got on my other screen, if I go in here and say this, then I'm actually instructing Visual Studio Code to get the bootstrapper and get the configuration file from my Nexus server rather than from reaching out from Cake itself. So if we save that and go back to here, if I go ahead and download a bootstrapper again, but this time it's coming from my Nexus server rather than from the outside world one, we'll get a new build.ps1 file. If I go ahead and select for compare and then grab this second one, what we should hopefully see, if I did that properly, select for compare and then compare, what you'll see, the changes that I've made on the one that I've pushed onto my Nexus server is that I've specified that the NuGet download URL is, rather than coming from NuGet.org itself, I'm saying that NuGet.exe is coming from my local server. So again, I'm hosting that file internally and I'm downloading it from there as part of the build. In the same way that when I reach out for the packages.config file, I'm not reaching out to cake.net to get that, I'm downloading it from Nexus again. And further down, anytime I do a invocation of NuGet.exe as part of the bootstrapper, I've added on this additional source. So I'm specifying that the source to get those packages is coming from here, rather than, again, reaching out to the default source, which would be NuGet.org. So I've done that across that bootstrapper file. And then in addition, so now I'm saying the configuration file that I want to download is coming from my internal Nexus server. If I go ahead and download that configuration file and open that up, what we'll see here is that I'm specifying that the NuGet source, whenever a NuGet operation is done within Cake itself, I'm specifying that that source should again come from that internal Nexus server rather than reaching out to the internet. So with all those changes in place, if I go ahead and delete everything within the tools folder, so I'm just going to delete that tools folder, and I've still got my build.cake file, which I can leave open, and I've got my build.ps1 file, which is the one that I pulled down from my Nexus server. So if I go ahead and run that build again, then I'm still going to get NuGet.exe downloaded because it reached out to the Nexus server to pull that down. I'm still getting a packages.config file because again, that's hosted on my Nexus server, and I've pulled down the Cake package and it's resolved that into the tools folder. But none of that has reached out to the internet. All of those assets have been downloaded from an internally hosted server. So on top of that, if we then go to here and say we wanted to install a tool, or an add-in perhaps, let's go for an add-in and make this cake.transifex. That just happens to be one of the add-ins I have on my Nexus server loaded up. If I go ahead and add that in, and now I run that build again, then Cake via the bootstrapper is going to resolve that add-in from my Nexus server rather than reaching out to the internet. Okay, so as a final test that all of that's working, once again I'm going to delete that tools folder. I'm going to come over to my network connection, which unfortunately you can't see, but trust me when I say I am disconnecting from the internet. Connect to profile, Wi-Fi off. So my Wi-Fi connection is now disconnected. And if I run that build again, then tools folder is still being populated with Cake itself. It's downloading the Transifex add-in, and it's then going to run the build. There we go. So the output of the build is successful, and then I can go back and connect to the internet again so that I have a connection again. And that, as they say, is that. So hopefully, with those things in mind, you'll see exactly what needs to be changed in order to make your Cake files, or your Cake scripts rather, work internally. So as a quick recap, the most important things is within your cake.config file, you need to change the default NuGet source to be something other than reaching out to the internet. You would want to modify your build.ps1 file to include internal URLs for downloading the required assets as part of the build. And any add-ins and Cake itself would need to be hosted somewhere. So like I say, either within a Nexus server or a ProGet server, or even the open source NuGet gallery would work as well. As long as you can host those NuGet packages somewhere and you can reference those, then you can make them all internal assets that you can use as part of your build. Hope this has been useful. If there's anything else you need to know about Cake, feel free to reach out and we can get some more videos created for you. Thank you very much.